Imagine being called a racist just because you asked your neighbor to move his car. That's exactly what happened to me. I joined my HOA board because I wanted to keep the peace, not stir up drama. I wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed enforcing rules or throwing fines at people. I believed an HOA should protect neighbors, not harass them. But one small parking issue changed everything. I politely asked my next-door neighbor to stop using up a guest spot because a new family had just moved in, and their elderly mother, who could barely walk, needed the space. I thought it was a simple, reasonable request. Instead, he filed complaints, accused me of harassment, and even claimed I was targeting him because of his race. Overnight, I went from being a quiet, fair board member to being painted as the villain of my own street, and what followed after that was a nightmare I never saw coming. When I first agreed to join my neighborhood's HOA board, I wasn't looking for power or recognition. I wasn't one of those people who dreamed about telling my neighbors what they could or couldn't do. In fact, the reason I said yes was because I thought I could make things fairer, a little more reasonable, and maybe even protect my community from the kind of harassment that HOAs are infamous for. I've never liked the idea of being the neighborhood cop, and I've never enjoyed conflict. But I told myself that if I was on the board, at least I could be a voice of balance. I could make sure rules were enforced in a way that was consistent and logical, not petty or mean-spirited. For the first year, I kept my head down and tried to handle issues quietly. Most of the time, that meant sending out reminders about trash cans or asking people to mow their lawns. Simple, routine stuff. It was never personal. And for the most part, it wasn't difficult until the parking situation with my next-door neighbor became unavoidable. You see, our neighborhood has a simple rule. Every house gets 2 parking spots. That's it. If you own 3 cars, the third one needs to go into the overflow lot. The overflow lot isn't perfect, it's a little further away, and not as convenient, but that's the whole point. It keeps the main areas clear and makes sure guest spots are available when people visit. On paper, the rule is fair. In practice, it depends on whether people respect it. For as long as I can remember, my next-door neighbor has had 3 cars. He and his family fill up their 2 designated spots, and then they slide their 3rd car into the guest space. I'd noticed it for over a year. But honestly, I chose to look the other way. At first, I didn't even know whose car it was. It was just another vehicle parked a little too comfortably in a space that wasn't meant for it. And even once I realized it belonged to my neighbor, I told myself it wasn't worth stirring the pot. Why go knocking on someone's door over something that, at the time, didn't seem urgent? That was my attitude. Avoid unnecessary drama. After all, the neighborhood wasn't overflowing with guests every weekend. People visited here and there, but it wasn't like we were competing for space on a daily basis. So, I let it slide. Week after week, month after month. I ignored the fact that his car had practically made that guest spot into its permanent home. But then, a couple of months ago, a new family moved in down the street. They seemed nice enough, quiet, respectful, just trying to settle in. The difference was that the homeowner's elderly mother lived with them, and she had serious health problems. Walking long distances wasn't just uncomfortable for her, it was unsafe. She needed to park close to the house. The problem was, the 2 driveway spots were already full. So, sometimes, the mother would leave her car half on the curb, half in the street, squeezed awkwardly behind her son's cars. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. At night, her car was practically invisible until you were right up on it, and it was technically blocking part of the road. I could already imagine the complaints if someone's bumper clipped it, or worse, if an emergency vehicle couldn't get through. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep ignoring my neighbor's 3rd car. His long-term borrowing of the guest spot was now directly creating a safety issue for someone else in the neighborhood. The guest space that could have gone to a visitor in need was occupied by a resident who simply didn't want to walk the extra distance to overflow. So, I made a decision I had avoided for more than a year. I went next door to have a conversation. I told myself I wasn't going to be aggressive or accusatory. I wasn't even going to frame it as a violation, at least not at first. Instead, I wanted to explain the situation, make it clear that this wasn't about punishing him, but about solving a real problem. When he answered the door, I did my best to be polite. I explained that I'd noticed his 3rd car in the guest spot, and while I hadn't made an issue of it before, things had changed. I told him about the new neighbor's mom, about how she struggled to walk and needed close access. I pointed out that when she couldn't use a guest spot, she ended up parking in ways that were unsafe and against the rules. I was careful with my words. I didn't want him to feel like he was being singled out. I even said, I know this probably feels like a hassle, but the guest spaces really are meant for visitors, not residents. If you could start parking your 3rd car in the overflow, it would make a big difference for them. I expected maybe a sigh, maybe a grumble about the inconvenience, but eventually agreement. After all, I let him get away with it for over a year. I thought he'd appreciate the fact that I'd been lenient, that I was explaining things calmly, with context, But in hindsight, maybe that was my biggest mistake, assuming reason and empathy would be enough. I thought that would be the end of it. One polite conversation, one small adjustment, and we'd all move forward. That was the story I told myself when I walked back into my house that day. I'd done my duty as a board member, but I'd also done it as a neighbor. No threats, no warnings, no citations, just an honest explanation of why the situation needed to change. But within a week, I realized how wrong I had been. It started with a message to the HOA board, a formal complaint. I opened my email, and there it was, typed out in neat little paragraphs, with my neighbor's name attached at the bottom. He had gone straight to the association to accuse me of harassment and targeting. According to him, I was singling him out for behavior that dozens of residents engaged in regularly. He described it as unfair, as selective enforcement. He even suggested that my request had nothing to do with rules or safety, but everything to do with me disliking him personally. I sat there, staring at the screen, completely stunned. Out of all the possible reactions I had imagined, this was the one I hadn't even considered. I had been bracing for annoyance, maybe even some defensiveness, but not a full-blown formal complaint, not an attack on my character. What threw me the most was the exaggeration. He claimed that so many residents were doing the same thing, using guest parking for their extra cars. But that simply wasn't true. I'd been watching parking patterns for over a year as part of my board responsibilities. Yes, sometimes a guest car would sit for a few days, maybe even a week, but it was rare to see a resident treat a guest spot like their own private driveway. My neighbor wasn't part of a crowd. He was the exception. When the board met, we discussed the complaint. It was quickly dismissed. Everyone knew the reality of our parking enforcement, and they knew my approach. I wasn't the kind of board member who went around looking for fights. In fact, most of the time, I was criticized for being too lenient. My reputation, if anything, was for avoiding conflict, not creating it. So the complaint went nowhere. But that didn't make it feel any less personal to me. I couldn't help but replay the conversation in my head, over and over again. I remembered how careful I had been with my words, how I had gone out of my way to explain the situation without making him feel attacked. Yet here I was, painted as some kind of villain, a board member who was supposedly abusing their authority to target a neighbor. I tried to shrug it off. After all, the board hadn't bought into it. They had seen it for what it was, a defensive move from someone who didn't like being told no. But something inside me shifted after that first complaint. Suddenly, I realized that my role wasn't just about balancing fairness and rules, it was also about perception. And perception, I was learning, could be twisted in ways that made the truth almost unrecognizable. The days after the complaint, I noticed a change in my neighbor's behavior. He started watching me more closely. When I left my house, his eyes seemed to follow me. When I came home, I could see him glance up, like he was taking mental notes. It was subtle, but it was there, a new tension that hadn't existed before. What frustrated me most was how unnecessary it all was. If he had simply said, "Fine, I'll move the car," the issue would have ended right there. But by escalating it into a formal complaint, he had turned a small rule enforcement into a personal battle. And I knew, even back then, that this wasn't going to stop with just one email. For me, that first confrontation was a turning point. It was when I started to realize that being on the HOA board wasn't just about handling lawns and parking spots. It was about navigating human pride, defensiveness, and suspicion. You could be as polite as you wanted, as reasonable as possible, and still, someone could twist it into an attack. At night, I found myself lying awake, replaying our conversation and wondering if I had made some mistake. Should I have phrased it differently? Should I have waited longer before saying anything? Or was this just inevitable? The moment I stopped, ignoring his behavior, the truth was, I hadn't harassed him. I had spoken to him one time, in the calmest way I knew how. That was it. And yet, here I was, being accused of being the very kind of board member I had promised myself I'd never become. I didn't know it at the time. But that complaint was only the beginning. He wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. If the first complaint had rattled me, the second one nearly knocked the wind out of me. A few weeks after the board dismissed his initial claim, another message appeared in our system. This time the tone was sharper, more emotional, and far more serious. He was no longer just accusing me of harassment. He was accusing the entire HOA of discrimination. According to him, the only reason I felt comfortable telling him to move his car was because he was black. He wrote that plenty of residents used the guest spaces for their extra vehicles, and none of them, because they weren't black, had been told to stop. In his eyes, this wasn't about a parking rule anymore. It was about race. I remember sitting in front of my computer, staring at the words. My stomach tightened. Discrimination, harassment. Those weren't just casual complaints anymore. Those were accusations that could ruin reputations, divide communities, and in some cases even lead to legal consequences. And the part that made it sting the most, it wasn't true. None of it was true. I had spoken to him exactly once. That was the extent of my targeting. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened. I hadn't even mentioned rules in a harsh way. I had explained the situation politely, emphasizing the new neighbor's mother and the safety concerns. I thought I was being empathetic, but to him, that conversation had become evidence of racial discrimination. The more I read his complaint, the more surreal it felt. He listed examples of other cars he'd seen in guest spots vehicles that belonged to residents who weren't black. He insisted that I had ignored them while coming after him, but here was the reality. There was no way for me to know who those cars belonged to unless I literally saw the driver step out, and most of those cars, they came and went within a few days. Maybe they belonged to out-of-town relatives. Maybe Maybe two friends visiting for the week. In our neighborhood, we allowed guests to stay up to a week without issue. But his car had been there every single day. Not for a week, not for a month, for more than a year. The difference between a visitor and a permanent resident was obvious to me, but in his complaint, he blurred that line completely, painting a picture where the only reason I had acted was because of race. I wish I could say I brushed it off, that I reminded myself the board already knew the truth and wouldn't take it seriously, but the accusation gnawed at me. Once something like that is said out loud, it hangs in the air, even if it isn't proven. People whisper, people wonder. Even if they don't believe it, the seed of doubt is planted. I drafted a careful response. I laid out the timeline, explained the circumstances, and reminded the board that I had acted only after safety concerns were raised by the new neighbor's family. I emphasized that I had not targeted anyone, that I had treated his situation no differently than I would have treated anyone else's. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about perception, about how a single narrative, true or not, could reframe an entire situation. And once someone plays the discrimination card, it changes the rules of engagement completely. That was when I began to notice the shift in my neighborhood, too. Neighbors started asking subtle questions. Hey, what's going on with the parking thing? I heard there was some kind of complaint. What happened? Nobody came right out and said it, but I could see the curiosity. In their eyes, they wanted to know if the rumors were true. I had made me feel exposed, like every move I made was being scrutinized. I started second-guessing myself. If I asked someone else about their trash bins or reminded someone to mow their lawn, would they also accuse me of targeting them? Would they assume my intentions were anything but fair? For the first time, I felt the real weight of being on the HOA board. It wasn't about rules anymore. It wasn't even about fairness. It was about surviving. Perception, navigating a minefield, where even the simplest action could be twisted into something ugly. I never set out to harass my neighbor. I never set out to single him out. But his accusations had made me something I never wanted to be, the enemy. And the worst part was, no matter how I explained the truth, he didn't want to hear it. He wasn't looking for resolution anymore. He was looking for a fight, and I was starting to realize that this fight wasn't going to end with just a couple of complaints. When my neighbor's second complaint landed, I thought the worst part of it would be the accusation itself. But what I didn't fully realize was how it would get tangled up in the larger reputation of the board. Because here's the truth, in every HOA, there's always that one person, the one who seems to thrive on confrontation, who doesn't just enforce rules but enjoys it. Like they've been waiting their whole life for the chance to wield a little power over their neighbors. In our neighborhood, that person was a fellow board member we all privately referred to as Karen. Karen didn't technically oversee my street, thank God for that, but she was notorious in the areas she did manage. She had a reputation for nitpicking the smallest violations, the wrong shade of mulch, a trash can left out for an extra few hours, a wreath that was too large for the season. People hated dealing with her, and to be honest, so did I. She treated the HOA rules like weapons rather than guidelines, and she wielded them with a kind of smug satisfaction that rubbed everyone the wrong way. The irony was that Karen was black herself, and over the past year, she had racked up her own share of discrimination complaints, not from black residents, but from Hispanic and Middle Eastern families who lived on her streets. They claimed she singled them out, that she harassed them, that she applied the rules unevenly. So when my neighbor started throwing around accusations of racial discrimination, it was almost too easy for some people to lump me into the same category. They didn't stop to think about the differences between us, about the fact that my approach was the opposite of Karen's. All they saw was another board member enforcing a rule. And thanks to Karen's behavior, enforcing a rule had started to look a lot like targeting someone. That realization made me angry in a way I wasn't expecting. I had joined the board precisely because I didn't want it to be dominated by people like her. I wanted balance, fairness, a calm approach. I wanted to make sure that the board wasn't just a place where petty personalities turned into neighborhood tyrants. And yet, here I was, being painted with the same brush as the one person I'd spent months quietly pushing back against. It was a no-win situation. If I defended myself too strongly, it would look like I was dismissing discrimination claims entirely, which wasn't true. I understood why people sometimes felt targeted. It happened all the time with Karen. But if I didn't defend myself, if I just stayed quiet, the assumption would grow that maybe the accusations had some merit. The board meetings became tense. Every time Karen opened her mouth, I could feel the resentment building in the room. Residents would glare at her, sometimes even at the rest of us by association, and the more hostile they grew toward her, the more defiant she became, doubling down on her rigid interpretations of the rules. I noticed something interesting during those meetings. Karen seemed to relish the conflict. She thrived on the idea that people feared her, that her presence commanded attention, even if it was negative. I, on the other hand, shrank from it. I hated the way my neighbor's complaint had dragged me into that same orbit. It wasn't just about a parking space anymore. It wasn't even about him, specifically. It was about the way one bad board member had poisoned the well for all of us. Suddenly, anything we did was viewed with suspicion. Any request we made was seen as harassment. Any reminder we gave about the rules was interpreted as a personal attack. I started to realize just how fragile the line was between being seen as fair and being seen as abusive. You could cross it in the eyes of your neighbors without even meaning to, simply because someone else before you had already left scars. The most frustrating part was that my neighbor's accusations were tapping directly into that community. Resentment. His claims didn't exist in a vacuum. They were amplified by the fact that people already distrusted the HOA. They already had examples in their minds of times they'd felt singled out or bullied. And even though those examples had nothing to do with me, they gave his story weight, that it was like trying to swim upstream in a river that had already decided its direction. No matter how calm or reasonable I was, I couldn't undo the perception that the board was hostile. And if the board was hostile, then by extension, I was hostile too. Asterisk. That was the trap I found myself in, guilty by association, stuck in the shadow of Karen's heavy-handedness. My neighbor didn't need proof to make his case. All he needed was to point at the HOA's reputation and say, "See, this is what they do." And in that atmosphere, who was really going to argue with him? After the second complaint, things between my neighbor and me never returned to normal. The simple, casual friendliness that should exist between people who live next door to each other was gone. In its place was something heavier and invisible. Tension that hung in the air every time I stepped outside my door. It wasn't paranoia. I could feel his eyes on me. If I went out to get the mail, he'd glance up. If I pulled into my driveway, he'd linger just a moment too long, as if he was taking mental notes. Sometimes I'd catch him standing at his window when I was walking my dog, his curtain shifting ever so slightly, like he wanted me to know he was watching. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I was unsettled. There's something deeply uncomfortable about realizing that your everyday actions, the mundane, ordinary parts of life, are being cataloged by someone who sees you as an enemy. I wasn't just a neighbor to him anymore. I was the villain. In his story, the HOA board member who had targeted him, and he wanted to keep a close eye on his villain. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that if I didn't react, if I just lived my life the same way I always had, maybe he'd eventually lose interest. But ignoring it didn't make it go away. If anything, it made me hyper-aware of how fragile my position really was. All it would take was one more complaint, one more misinterpretation of something I did, and suddenly I'd be dragged back into another exhausting defense of my character. It was a strange position to be in, because I had never thought of myself as someone who wielded power. I joined the board to keep things balanced, to make sure people weren't bullied. And yet, because of one conversation, I was now painted as part of the problem. Damned if I did, damned if I didn't. If I enforced a rule, I was a harasser. If I ignored a violation, I was neglecting my duty. There was no winning. What bothered me most was how little it had taken to get here. One polite request, that was it. One conversation where I'd carefully explained a safety concern. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't issued a citation. I hadn't even mentioned a fine, but to him, it was proof of something much larger, something sinister. And once that narrative took root in his mind, there was nothing I could say to shake it. I started to see the bigger picture. The part nobody tells you when you sign up for an HOA board. You're not just managing rules. You're managing people's pride, their defensiveness, their sense of fairness, and sometimes their fear. And when those things get twisted, when someone feels cornered or embarrassed, they lash out. They don't just argue about the rule. They go after your character, your intentions, your reputation. In quiet moments, I thought about stepping down from the board. It would have been so easy to hand in my resignation and wash my hands of the whole thing. No more complaints. No more sideways glances from neighbors wondering if the rumors were true. No more being lumped in with people like Karen. But another part of me resisted, because if people like me, the ones who were trying to be fair, who weren't in it for power, gave up, then the Karens of the world would take over completely. And then what? The whole neighborhood would suffer. So I stayed. I endured the looks, the tension, the knowledge that my neighbor was watching. I learned to move a little more carefully, to double-check myself before I spoke, to make sure I was documenting everything. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Because once an accusation of harassment or discrimination is out there, you live under a microscope, whether you deserve it or not. Looking back, I realized that this experience changed me. It made me more cautious, more deliberate. It made me understand just how thankless this role can be. You can pour your energy into doing the right thing. You can go out of your way to be respectful, and still end up as the bad guy in someone else's story. And maybe that's the real truth about being on an HOA board. It's not about lawns or fences or parking spaces. It's about trust. And once a neighbor decides you can't be trusted fairly or unfairly, there's no rulebook in the world that can fix that. So I live with it. I live with the sideways glances, with the watchful eyes, with the uncomfortable tension of knowing that, in one man's mind, I'll always be the villain. And I remind myself, every time I feel the weight of it pressing down on me, that fairness still matters. Even if it comes at a cost. Even if nobody thanks you for it. Even if it leaves you living under watchful eyes, ***.